Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. What can the Timberwolves do to counter Denver's what's been fantastic Denver Nuggets defense for 7 of the first 8 quarters of the series? What the Wolves must do on offense. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend and happy Timberwolves game day. We're going to talk all about Game 3 Wolves Nuggets back at Target Center tonight. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. All right, so the story so far of this series through 2 games has been Denver dominated the first 6 quarters and easily won basically 7 of the 8 quarters, with the exception being quarter 3 of game 2. During the season, the Wolves and Nuggets split 4 games that they played. There were a lot of injuries on both sides. In fact, Towns, I don't think, played it at all against the Nuggets. Denver had the one game on a back-to-back where they sent only one starter to Minnesota, and the Wolves won that game. There was one game where Denver was mostly full strength. The Wolves were missing some guys. Minnesota won that game. But it was like the season series, we can't glean a ton from it. And on top of that, Denver this season was a pretty mediocre defensive team, basically middle of the pack by most defensive metrics. I believe they were, I'm going to pull it up real quick. I believe they were 16th or 17th in defensive rating. Over at Basketball Reference, they finished 15th in defensive rating while being a top 5 offense. And Denver has struggled at times defensively in the postseason the last few years, which is why, despite being one of the best regular season teams, they've generally struggled in the playoffs. The bubble season, they did go to the conference finals. I don't want to overlook that too much. I mean, considering that's the best ever Timberwolves season in Wolves history was going to the conference finals. So clearly, like, we're nitpicking a little bit here, but Denver needs to improve defensively in the playoffs as a general rule. They've been great defensively in 7 of 8 quarters against the Wolves. Now, of course, in quarter 3 of game 2, the Wolves scored 40 points on basically 80% shooting and kind of had their way, but Denver locked back in the fourth quarter and has really held Minnesota's offense down. Now, I also think it's important to remind, especially anybody that's not a Wolves fan listening or watching this, the Timberwolves were not a good offensive team this year. And I know if you didn't look at the numbers, you would say that's insane. They have Anthony Edwards, they have Karl-Anthony Towns, they've got Mike Conley, they used to have D'Angelo Russell. Like, they've got tons of offensive talent. What do you mean? Well, Towns missed 52 games consecutively and more than that overall this season. The Rudy Ant pairing never got figured out. Rudy and Cat only played 20 some games together. There's a lot of reasons why this offense didn't look the way that it should have this year. And so Denver is playing great defensively. They're doing this against a team in Minnesota that finished 23rd in offensive rating, which is, we're going to spend a lot of time this offseason unpacking the Wolves offense and a supposed offensive, genius in Chris Finch and a Wolves team with offensive talent like Anthony Edwards. You could throw in Rudy Gobert, even if it's a limited run with Karl-Anthony Towns. It's not like the offense has been gangbusters with him on the floor. Like, what gets figured out this offseason, because it's got to get figured out, right? That's a conversation for another day. But I wanted to kind of lay that baseline for, like, hey, Denver's doing really well defensively. But, unless we're talking A-game Timberwolves, a good team should be able to figure out the Wolves offense and stop them at this point in time, given how they played this season offensively. So anyway, I want to talk a little bit about what Denver has been doing and the Wolves' potential counter. I spent some time on Wednesday leading into game 2, actually Tuesday and Wednesday leading into game 2, talking about the Wolves' substitution patterns. My suggestion was, hey, the Wolves need to run more pick and roll with Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert, space the floor with Karl-Anthony Towns, and with Anthony Edwards. And yes, you can run some Ant and Rudy actions, but that synergy has not quite been there. We know that Conley and Gobert have a chemistry, by putting Towns somewhere else and using him as an off-ball catch-and-shoot guy, a cutter. Maybe you're running the pick-and-roll action, and Towns is, you can swing the ball to Towns, and he gets a quick single coverage, right? He's not in the post. He's not getting doubled. He can get the ball and then be decisive, which has been another issue for him on and off throughout his career, really. Does he catch and shoot? Does he pump, fake, and drive? Whatever that is, it needs to happen quickly. But by playing him off the ball and away from the primary action, you're giving him that extra split second to make that decision. You're also giving Rudy Gobert the best chance to succeed by running a lot of actions in pick and roll with Cat in the middle of the floor, or by posting him up with Rudy on the floor. The spacing gets all jumbled. And that's the concern from day one of this trade that people had. It's one of the concerns people had when the Wolves drafted Walker Kessler in the first place last year was, are you really going to play 2 7-footers when one of them, now with Kessler, obviously he could space the floor a little bit, certainly more than Rudy Gobert. But how does this work if Cat wants to post, but where else is Rudy going to be? He's not going to be on the perimeter. So that means he's in the dunker spot, and your spacing's all messed up because they can just help off of Rudy. And that's a really tough angle for Cat to throw a lob to Rudy. And like, he's done it a few times, but how many times has the ball been turned over in that situation? Even if you're running pick and roll with Cat in the middle of the floor, Rudy's probably in the dunker spot. And now he's rolling right. Cat's rolling right into Rudy. So when those guys are on the floor, your primary actions have to be middle of the floor, Gobert and Conley, or Gobert and Ant, with Conley spacing to catch and shoot, or Ant spacing to cut or catch and shoot, or dribble handoffs with Anthony Edwards. We've seen a little bit of success with that in this series, with the Wolves running pin downs into dribble handoffs. That's actually worked really well, and I think the Wolves should do more of it. But with Towns out on the perimeter and spacing, that's your best spacing you have as a team. Because without Jaden McDaniels, this team loses a 40% three-point shooter. I know that, like, for me, after 3 years of watching Jaden McDaniels, it's easy to forget because he was a pretty mediocre three-point shooter, especially above the arc for the majority of his first 2 seasons. But he was 39.8% this year. He was 40% from the perimeter. It's a huge loss. And Conley's been great. But again, if Conley's involved in that action in the middle of the floor and you're swinging the ball, who's it going to? I mean, it's Kyle Anderson. It's Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And it's Taurean Prince when he's not in foul trouble. And I want to dig a bit more into that here next. There was actually, so I had planned this all out to talk about this and to kind of revisit what I talked about Tuesday and Wednesday, which actually, by the way, the other piece of that, quick side note, was rotation-wise to try and get either Jalen Noel or Jordan McLaughlin on the floor more with Karl-Anthony Towns. We saw no Jordan McLaughlin minutes, which I also said on Wednesday I was fine with because he's been really bad the last couple of weeks. He just has been. But Jalen Noel didn't play great either. And I'd have to go back. I meant to go back and look exactly to see how those minutes lined up with Cat. But the point still stands that Noel and Cat together are very good on the floor. So if Rudy's off the floor and Cat's playing the 5, that's when Jalen Noel should only get on the floor in that situation. There's no reason to play him with Rudy Gobert. I don't think that if he's running any offense, I don't trust Jalen Noel's passing enough to get the ball to Rudy successfully. And teams also know that Noel would prefer to drive into the mid-range, and then your spacing's all jumbled anyway with Rudy rolling and Noel, driving. And so anyway, if Noel's on the floor, it should be with Cat as the center, period. That's, full stop. Okay, I want to get a little bit more into what Denver specifically is doing defensively and the Wolves' potential counter to that. As I said, I planned this all out, and I talked a little bit about it Tuesday, Wednesday. And then Zach Lowe at ESPN actually had an article that really, it was focused on Denver's defensive approach, and it posted either late Thursday or early Friday. So go check that out. It's an ESPN Plus insider article. But Zach does an awesome job of breaking down the Nuggets defense. And there's a couple points I'm going to make that I'll support with things from his piece. But he did a really good job with that article, and it's a good insight into what Denver's doing and why it's working against the Wolves. So go check that out at ESPN, and we'll dive a bit into that more here in just a minute. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Nissan with the all-new electric Nissan Ariya. Nissan's most electric player of the week is brought to you by the all-new all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya. The Timberwolves player of the week, the Nissan Ariya player of the week has to be Anthony Edwards. The last 2 games, game 1 and game 2, Anthony Edwards has been the Wolves' best all-around player. He's actually played well. He scored 41, of course, in game 2, but he had 18 in game 1. So for the series, he's averaging 29.5 points, 4.5 assists per game, while shooting just under 53% for the field and 50% on threes. He's 7 of 14 on three-point attempts so far in the series, averaging 7 free throws per game, shooting 86% from the line. Like Ant's line has been fantastic. He has been, especially on Wednesday in game 2, brilliantly fierce. He has been fiercely elegant, and as he always is, with the ball in his hands going towards the basket, Anthony Edwards has been stunningly powerful, just like the 2023 Nissan Ariya. The 2023 Nissan Ariya packs pin you to your seat power and premium intelligence all-in-one EV. The all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya, the EV for people who love to drive. Shop now at nissanusa.com. All right, a big thank you again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. A reminder, everydayers, we will have the live postcast following the game tonight with myself and Martin Gellner for Bally Sports North. That's live on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. And then you can also listen, if you can't watch it live, it will be about 45 minutes after the game, after she does the Bally postgame show on Bally Sports North. So I don't know, it'll be what, like 11:30, 11:45-ish p.m. likely tonight, if it's not an overtime game. That is when we'll go live on Locked On Sports Minnesota. But if you don't watch it live on this Friday night, you can catch it on the audio feed after the fact. So listen to it Saturday, over the weekend, or whenever. And then we'll do the same thing Sunday. We'll do the live postcast again, and then we'll also have the postgame pod posting early Monday morning after game 4. So tons of content still coming up this weekend. Make sure you're following and subscribe to both Locked On Wolves and also Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube as well. All right, digging a bit more into Denver. And again, Zach Lowe talked about this and broke it down in detail in his article over at ESPN.com on his insider article. But he talked a little bit about how Denver during the season, Jokic kind of plays a bit of no man's land and pick and roll game, but in a good way. He basically plays at the level of the ball screen. A lot of teams drop, like the Wolves drop with Rudy Gobert. They dropped for years with Karl-Anthony Towns. It did not work, which, of course, was different than the Tom Thibodeau scheme of icing the pick and roll. But Towns would drop. Teams would score against the Wolves in bunches. After the coaching staff changed, they started last season with the personnel they had. The Wolves blitzed the pick and roll a lot. They tried to essentially trap the ball on the perimeter. Jared Vanderbilt was very good at this. Ant and others were so good off the ball. Patrick Beverley getting steals off the ball that you could just kind of play this breakneck pressure defense. And the only teams that could really beat it were the really well-coached teams. And then also, as the season wore on, teams kind of caught up to like, hey, here's what the Wolves were doing. We can hit this skip pass. We can, swing the ball quickly, get a back cut, and score on this defense. This season, with the personnel the Wolves have, Rudy Gobert can't play a blitzing defense. He can't switch all the time. So playing drop with Rudy Gobert makes sense, and keeping Karl-Anthony Towns out of as many pick and roll actions as possible when Rudy's on the floor. So when Towns is on the floor, the Wolves will switch a little bit more. They will still play some drop. But when Rudy's on the floor, they almost exclusively play drop. The Nuggets don't drop Jokic entirely because he doesn't have the length of, say, Rudy Gobert to contest mid-range jumpers, to recover, and he's also not a good rim protector. So he also can't blitz and he can't switch because he's not quick enough laterally. He doesn't have the length to be effective on a switch like that. So the trick with Jokic is trying to kind of have it both ways, where he basically plays at the level of the screen. He tries to, muddy things up and then recover to his man. That doesn't always work against the Wolves because Anthony Edwards is so dynamic. He can turn a corner if it's him involved in the action. You also don't want, if you're Denver, you don't want Jokic switched on to Anthony Edwards. So Denver's actually switched up their coverage quite a bit in this series. But depending on who's on the floor, they've done different things. And one of the key things goes back to the point I made at the end of the last segment, which is the Wolves' lack of shooters has allowed allowed the Nuggets to be able to overhelp and essentially guard the other three players that aren't involved in the action with two, or really if you count the screener / roller, you're guarding 4 with 3 and committing 2 to the ball. So when it's Anthony Edwards, you're committing 2 to the ball. You're telling your other 3 defenders to guard Rudy plus the other 3 Wolves on the floor. I mean, Rudy's a really good roller, and when he's diving to the rim, you have to account for him if you're Denver. And so somebody has to be checking Rudy. That leaves 2 to guard 3 on the perimeter. Not including the ball handler. So say it's Mike Conley involved in the action. That means you're guarding Anthony Edwards. You're guarding, in game 1, Nickeil Alexander-Walker started. And, I guess Karl-Anthony Towns would be the other one. So you can overhelp to Towns and Edwards and leave the non-shooter open. So in that case, it was Nickeil Alexander-Walker. It becomes harder when you have better shooters on the floor. So Taurean Prince started game 2, got into a ton of foul trouble, but he knocked down, 3 or 4 threes in that game? What did he have? He had 3 threes in 18 minutes. Taurean Prince did. Scored 12 points, but he had 5 fouls, so he only played 18 minutes. I think Prince should start game 3, and I think the Wolves should be, their film study should show them, hey, here's what Denver's doing when Alexander Walker's on the floor. Let's dare them to do that with Prince on the floor. We can, in a sense, you are almost baiting them, and then hit that skip pass to Prince or a quick bang, bang, swing the ball to Prince in the corner or in the slot and get him an open 3. Taurean Prince is a better shooter than Nickeil Alexander-Walker. For the season, Prince was 38%. He's around that for his career. He's been over 40% a couple times. He can get hot, as we saw in his 30-plus point game against the Knicks a few weeks ago. And frankly, even in game 2, before he was in foul trouble, Prince is going to be key to knocking down those open shots. And Alexander Walker, if he can hit enough to be effective, remember how well he shot the ball over those first few games when he was in the Wolves rotation. Now, he's only 36% in a Wolves uniform for the season. And Nickeil Alexander-Walker for his career is 34%. He was 38% overall between Utah and Minnesota this season. But coming into this year, he was like 33% for his career. So Denver is totally fine with leaving Alexander Walker open. He's just got to hit a couple to keep them honest. They're also fine with leaving Kyle Anderson open, which is interesting because Kyle Anderson did shoot 41% from 3 this year, but it was also by far a career high. He's a career 34.5% three-point shooter. He was 33% last year for Memphis. So yeah, Anderson was great from 3 this year, but Denver's playing the long game here in terms of percentages and saying, you know what, Slow-Mo is not going to hit more than a couple threes in a game against us. We'd much rather commit 2 or commit 3 to the Conley Gobert or the Conley Towns or the Ant Gobert action and worry about whoever's not involved in the actions. Call it Towns and Conley on the perimeter if Ant and Rudy are in the action. We'd rather commit to those guys and leave that 5th guy mostly open and catch up to him on the rotation if we need to. The Wolves have burned them a couple times with this. And Denver was not crisp in the third quarter of game 2, and the Wolves burned them in a lot of different ways. But if that's how Denver is going to play it, the Wolves have to make them pay. And again, that means it's got to be Taurean Prince. And Jalen Noel's limited minutes, it's got to be him. He's got to make his open threes. And he struggled to make three-pointers this season. He was good last year after struggling the first couple years in his career. But Jalen Noel was 29% on threes this year. Now, I think he's better than that. I think he dealt with the knee issue and just had a terrible start to the season. But Denver's still okay leaving Jalen Noel open because he shot 29% from 3 this season. So whoever that is, whoever that 5th person on the floor is, the Wolves have to find them, make a crisp pass, and they have to make Denver pay. Otherwise, I don't know how you're going to beat this coverage against Denver because to this point, they've muddied things up enough that unless Ant can get a step on Jokic, or if Jokic doesn't play that perfectly and Ant can get downhill, you've got to find that open shooter. And then that open shooter has to make them pay. Now, with Towns, we'll talk about that here next, actually. I want to talk a little bit about Towns specifically and how to kind of reactivate him to hopefully he could do what he did in the first 3 quarters against the Lakers in the first playing game last week and for stretches against the Thunder as well. So I want to talk specifically about Towns next, but the overall most important piece to the Wolves offense right now, besides Ant being Ant, which he was for a good chunk of game 2 and actually a fair amount of game 1 as well, Ant needs to be Ant. But the Wolves also have to find whoever it is that the Nuggets are playing off of, and that person has to make the shot. And it's on Chris Finch to make sure that it's mostly Taurean Prince, a little bit of Jalen Noel, a little bit of Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and probably not any Jordan McLaughlin, frankly, because he was 30% from 3 this year and has really struggled lately on both ends of the floor. So it's the depth that was so good during the season with no Jaden McDaniels and no Naz Reid. It's not there anymore. Like the depth just isn't there. And in the playoffs, you really only should have 7 or 8 guys that are playing heavy minutes anyway. So we'll see how Finch plays this rotation wise, but it's imperative that they hit that skip pass or hit the quick swing to the other side of the floor and that they're, either getting that open shot, attacking a closeout, whatever that is. That space is so important to the Wolves doing anything successfully on offense. All right. I want to close by talking a little bit about Karl-Anthony Towns and then it's game time, game 3 tonight. All right. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know that the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, Karl-Anthony Towns in this series. You probably don't need me to tell you how much he struggled, but he has struggled. He was so good against the Lakers last week. He was good against the Thunder on Friday. And then game 1 on Sunday against Denver, he shoots 5 of 15, 11 points, 10 rebounds, 4 turnovers. Game 2 on Wednesday, he scores 10 points on 3 of 12, has 10 boards and 5 turnovers. So overall, over the 2 games, we did Ants line earlier as part of the Nissan Aria Player of the Week. Towns is averaging 10.5 points and 11 rebounds. He's shooting under 30% from the field, 29.6% from the field, 25% from 3. He's attempted 2 free throws per game, 4 total free throws. He's turned it over 4.5 times per game. It's been a really bad 2-game stretch for Karl-Anthony Towns. He's got to wake up at some point. And the Wolves have to help get him in the right position to succeed. I talked a little bit about this the other day, but they can't post Karl-Anthony Towns up, not on the low block against Denver. Denver's too intelligent of a defense. Jokic is too good/savvy of a post defender. Well, we talked earlier about how Jokic can't rim protect. He can't play in space. You don't want to switch with him if you're Denver. That doesn't change the fact that Jokic is a solid post defender. He's also, and this was something Marnie and I talked about on the postcast after Wednesday's game. I think I talked about it on the post-game pod Thursday too. Towns versus Jokic head-to-head is just bad from a mental standpoint, really, for Karl-Anthony Towns. I mean, the stray voltage that Chris Finch has talked about in the past with Towns, where he starts flailing and complaining to the officials and trying to move too quickly and draw fouls, and his arms get everywhere, and he hooks guys and he's throwing elbows, and it's that thing gets accelerated. It's more likely to happen when a player like Jokic, who does get under people's skin, and a team like Denver. I mean, Michael Malone has said this in the media, like their plan against Karl-Anthony Towns is to be physical and get under his skin, because that is the only way you can slow him down offensively, unless he's just having a bad shooting night. I thought game 1, it was more of that. I thought Towns got more clean looks and he just missed shots, and he had a couple of really bad passes in there. Wednesday was that, plus Denver was more physical with him, and the Wolves tried to force the issue a little bit too much at times. I think the answer with Towns, is to get him, well, like I said earlier, space him. And I know that sounds like, oh, you don't want to take your max guy, your all-NBA big, and just, put him in a Bogdanovich role, stick him in the corner. Yeah, except for he's going to shoot 40% from 3. And if teams are closing out on Towns, his pump fake and drive, like if you have, even if it's Aaron Gordon, but insert other Denver defender here, Towns is going to have either the size advantage or the quickness advantage. If it's Jokic coming out to the perimeter to guard him, Towns can pump fake and drive past him as long as he's not hooking, right? Which he tends to do sometimes. If it's a smaller defender, I know that Towns struggles to back down smaller defenders without drawing offensive fouls, but he could do that against, a Bruce Brown or, I don't know, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope isn't going to be matched up on him ideally if you're Denver, but on switches and rotations, like if he has a mismatch like that, he has to go after it. We've seen him shy away from doing that a couple of times already in this series, and we've seen this in the past where Towns doesn't demand the ball with a mismatch. Even if it's on the perimeter, like if he's facing up against a smaller player, just shoot over them. Or if Denver brings a bigger player, you can pump fake and drive. It really isn't that complicated. And yet somehow the Wolves and Towns have made it super complicated to just get him the ball in advantageous spots on the floor. I don't like him in the low post against Denver. I do think you could give him the ball. The mid post wasn't really working, especially in game 1 either. I think you could probably find maybe get him the ball at the elbow. And the Wolves haven't done a ton of that. They haven't ran nearly as much horns lately. But to get him the ball at the elbow and have him go to work, something like that has to happen for the Wolves to get him going. Last year, in the first round series against Memphis, remember the Wolves won game 1, and Towns was fantastic. He had 29 points, hit a couple of big threes, had 13 boards. He struggled in the game 2 blowout loss and in the game 3 home loss. The Wolves were down 2-1, and then narrowly won game 4 at home to force game 5 back in Memphis. And, well, I guess they would have had a game 5 either way. But to even the series going back to Memphis, and Cat was phenomenal in that game too. So the 2 wins the Wolves got against Memphis last year, Towns averaged 29 and 13, or he had 29 and 13 in the game 1 win. He had 33 and 14 in the game 4 win. In that game, he got to the line 17 times against Memphis. Now, Denver's better at defending without fouling than Memphis was last year. But the Wolves ran a ton of stuff through Towns. Towns also last season in that playoff series, over the course of 6 games, Karl-Anthony Towns averaged 4.5 turnovers. He turned the ball over a ton, but it was a little less noticeable because other than the game 3 stinker, he was generally really good in that series. He wasn't great in the elimination game 6, but he was generally good. And he had a couple of really big games in those 2 Timberwolves wins. So the Wolves need to do more of that. Run this stuff through Cat with Rudy off the floor. 100% of the offense should go through Karl-Anthony Towns when Rudy Gobert's off the floor. When Rudy's on the floor, space Towns, get him some open looks from 3. When Denver scrambles, when they run at him late, he can pump fake and drive, get Denver into foul trouble, take advantage of if and when you get into the bonus, and get Cat going that way. That has to be what Minnesota does here in game 3. It's obviously, goes without saying, it's a must-win game. You can't go down 3-0. If you win, you have a real chance on Sunday to even the series going back to Denver and put all the pressure back on the number 1 seed. And that's, at this point, the best case scenario, what we have to hope for. So it's all about what the Wolves do offensively. And I know by saying that, of course, now the Wolves will probably play a miserable defensive game on Friday. But in general, I think they've been okay on defense. I know Denver scored 122. I know this shot 54% for the field. But that goes back to, it was a flamethrower versus flamethrower late, Jamal Murray versus Anthony Edwards. In general, it was the transition defense early in the game that set Denver up with 64 points by halftime. Transition defense has been an issue all season for Minnesota. The half-court defense for the Timberwolves was okay in both of the first 2 games. And I believe that. If you could do what they did defensively for most of the first 2 games in the half-court, and just figure a couple things out on offense, which sounds so much easier said than done. But again, it's really not that complicated. Denver changing their schemes, doing what they're doing with Joker, that makes it difficult. But the Wolves now have 2 games of film on what Denver's doing. They're back home Friday night. Can Chris Finch and the Wolves figure this out offensively and put together a good offensive game, get Karl-Anthony Towns going? That's the big question on Friday. All right. Reminder, we'll go live after the game, the live postcast on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. Subscribe over there to be notified when Marnie Gellner and I go live. And then you can also listen after the fact on Locked On Wolves, wherever you listen to podcasts. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. A big thank you again for making us your first listen every day. Again, a reminder for the postcast tonight, postcast Sunday after game 4, win or lose, and then also the postgame pod on Monday. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.